We'll get to Peterson talking about Peter Pan in a bit, but first, I need to build on the intro from last time. We Christologists find it a necessity to follow Lobster Daddy on Twitter. He is at the top of their dominance hierarchy after all. As mentioned last time, there can occasionally be gold buried in his daily tweet barrage. But the tweets in this last video cycle could kick off a gold rush if he's not careful. There was him adding the Pope about social justice, astounding his Hindu followers with a bad take, and let's not forget his retweeting on the D-Trans Day of Awareness, an old joke tweet featuring Shoe on Head saying she, the author who is not Shoe on Head, had detransitioned. And note, this was already after Peterson had already confused Shoe for Blair White sometime previously. But the top lobster of these tweets was his quote tweeting content of men. How to describe with my words hamstrung in the first chunk of this video? Well, these men are hooked up to equipment and it all looks very medical and dystopian. The original tweet says this is happening in China. Peterson signal boosted that idea. Turns out the only thing that's true in the original tweet is yes, these guys are getting a cow-like experience. It's not China. It's not about birth rates or number of kids. It's recreational. I'm not going to be mad if this opening part of the Beyond Order videos just becomes a catalog of the stupidest things he's tweeted recently. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back. If you're new, I'm Cass, the cognitive psychologist, and we are hypothetically reading about how to find meaning in life, care of the Lobster Daddy himself, Dr. Jordan Burt Peterson. I say hypothetically because so far this chapter on noticing that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated has been more capitalist propaganda. Find your meaning in life by being a worker who is willing to go above and beyond at your own expense. It'll totally pay off, really. Because he said that's how these things work. And he's never wrong. Thankfully, we're moving on from that thought. But we're only moving out of the capitalist frying pan and into the more typical, what? Fire. May as well get into the incineration, right? So, quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, and this means we're talking about the single reference for the chunk of the book we're talking about in this video. And some other stuff. It's almost funny that the setup that requires the most work is also the least used. Oh well. We will get some use out of it today though, as the paper we're going to talk about is basically a cognitive paper. And you know me, I love me some cognitive. So, no time for dilly-dallying. Let's get to talking about meaning in the same way that homeopathic treatments contain active ingredients.
The idea that life is suffering is a relatively universal truism of religious thinking. This is the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, as well as a key Hindu concept. There is a tradition that the ancient Indian word for suffering, dukkha from the Pali language, or dukkha from Sanskrit, is derived from dus, bad, and kah, hole, particularly the hole in a horse-drawn cartwheel through which the axle passes. The proper place for such a hole is dead center, right on target. The ride is likely to be very bumpy otherwise, with the bumps directly proportional in magnitude to the degree of offset.
Where to start? Well, may as well pick the golden apples hanging closest to the ground, I suppose. It's interesting to me that Peterson and I can get such different messages from these things encouraging the middle path. I see these things, like this axle hole or Icarus flying too close to the sun, as saying to take things in moderation. Don't overly indulge in the things that make you happy, or make you sad for that matter if you're in that kind of mood, but also don't feel like you have to abstain from them altogether. But also be moderate with this approach. For example, I don't drink alcohol. My paternal line has a long history of alcoholism, and for the little bit I did drink in undergrad, I got the sense it could be a problem for me if I wasn't careful. Despite not having touched alcohol for almost 20 years now, there's rough days where I just want to get blackout drunk and not think and not feel anything. That's not good. Responsible drinking for me is to just not. Other people, like my husband, are able to be moderate in their drinking. and it makes them happy. Especially in my husband's case, as it's also a hobby for him with brewing, so cool for them. Peterson, however, seems to take them in a myriad of ways. In this case, given the larger context of what's been covered in the book so far, it seems like there's a subtext of saying the dead center culture is the one that will make the ride the smoothest. Push too far in any direction, and the ride gets bumpy. But this is coming from someone who sees serious implementation of trans-affirming care, vaccines, or fighting climate change as being driven by ideologically possessed narcissists who are trying to something globalists. To him, moderate seems to largely equate with traditional or conservative, which is a whole other can of worms we're going to leave in the can. Now to the more challenging stuff. I consulted with my Discord's general religious chat to pick the brains of our resident Buddhists, because it's a darndest thing, but I trust people who are actively practicing a religion to have a better understanding of its teachings. So, to start, let's quickly talk about the Four Noble Truths. Basically, suffering is a part of life. Suffering has identifiable causes. Suffering can be stopped or at least contained, and here's how to do it. Or to think about this in a different way, metaphorically, the four truths can be thought of as a doctor. Quoting Solius, the first truth is the diagnosis. The second is the underlying cause. The third is the prognosis. There is a way out. And the fourth is the prescription. An important part here that Peterson didn't include is that the point of the third truth is that you aren't doomed to suffer. You can ease your suffering by figuring out where your suffering's coming from and work to reduce it. Final thing here. There is an important difference between saying what Peterson is here, that life is suffering, and the actual Buddhist idea that suffering is a part of life. It's a slight difference in the phrasing, but has much larger implications. Life is suffering is a far more nihilistic raisin cookies of doom view, while suffering being a part of life implicitly gives you some space that isn't guaranteed full of suffering. Although, Peterson's building meaning advice is much more impactful if you buy into his belief that he is accurately describing reality, and he has the fix. The final thought of this paragraph on his interpretation of suffering in Buddhism is to say, quote, "This is quite reminiscent to me of the Greek term hamartia, which is frequently translated as sin in the context of Christian thought." And he goes on to say that this was originally an archery term and generally means missing the mark. This is very definitely a recurring thought from 12 Rules. That you need to have your vision clear, intentions set, so you can point your aim in the most meaningful direction. And if you don't have all of that, you are going to miss the mark and sin. Briefly, yeah, hamartia is missing the mark. Some extra bits to throw in from the wiki are that it's the tragic seed of someone's eventual downfall. It's almost a wonder he's not playing that tragic part up more, as it fits everything so well. He says there's many ways to miss the mark in a way that feels like a list setup, but then only talks about one before tangenting himself off another cliff. The singular hamartia discussed is that people, either in his personal life or former clients, never understood or communicated what they needed or wanted, and you can't hit what you can't aim at. This is expanded with the observation that not doing things upsets people more than the, quote, errors they actively committed while engaging with the world. And this idea is rounded out by saying that if you try something and you make a mistake, at least you can learn from that. And that is a lesser mistake than just not doing things to avoid messing up. Yes, you absolutely need to communicate your needs and wants and reinforce them when necessary. But equating a person's inability to communicate those to sin, with all of its huge religious implications, seems unhelpful. Don't need to pile on more guilt here, especially if a person already has a bunch from whatever religious upbringing they had. Back on the yes side, concerns or anxieties a person has should be worked on. Someone shouldn't feel isolated or afraid of life or the world. And that brings us to his reference for the claim that not trying things is more upsetting than messing up while trying things. To start, Peterson isn't totally off base or misrepresenting the basic gist of this paper. But there is more to it that's worth digging into. The authors were trying to test if actions were regretted more than inactions. Also, just as a note from the first page, this article includes some of one of the author's doctoral research. Normally this isn't a big deal, but we're going to get to a part of the paper that just, you can tell. Anyways, this topic had previously been studied with hypothetical vignettes, where participants were rating how much they think people will come to regret taking or not taking an action. In the case of this figure, which is representing work by a couple rare cognitive psych Nobel Prize winners, 2 hypothetical people are shown with their choices in solid black, and the path not taken shown with the dotted line. George has Intuit stock, and could hang on to it and hope it goes up in value, or he could change to Hudson food stock. Paul, on the other hand, has Hudson food stock, and could hold or switch to Intuit. As shown, George switches to Hudson while Paul stays the course. Unfortunately for them both, Hudson stayed the same price while Intuit went up. Participants were asked, who would regret their choice more, George or Paul? George switched, so he acted, and Paul didn't switch, so he was inactive. Note that both actors and inactors were met with the same hypothetical outcome. They found that participants thought that people who acted would regret their choice more than those who didn't act. There are a couple proposed reasons for why this might be the case. For one, we might feel more responsible for outcomes if we did some action leading up to it. Also, in the West, we're generally held more accountable for things we do than things we don't do. So we may have a bias to not act. Oh. Another explanation is that there might be some cognitive lopsidedness here, where it's easier to think of the things we shouldn't have done as opposed to thinking of the things we should have done. Hi. Kahneman and Tversky suggested that regret could then come from thinking of the ways to undo the consequences of an action or to get a better outcome.
Look, here comes the consequences of my actions chasing me right now.
This counterfactual thinking is argued to occur more for actions because they are more hypothetically changeable than inactions because reasons. This point may have been better argued in the original paper. Now, the key issue with pulling generalizations from these vignette experiments is that it involves participants guesstimating how much regret different actions or inactions would result in. But isn't inaction in itself a form of action? Sorry.
What do you mean, do?
It's possible that participants' guesstimates of regret don't match what their actual regret would be in those circumstances. Tied to that, it's also possible that this regret difference only really shows up when everything else is held equal, like the outcomes. But back in reality, there tends to be different outcomes for acting and not acting. Also, the nature of regret may be different for actions and inactions. The consequences versus the missed opportunity. Some telephone survey data suggested that the intensity of regret between the two isn't different, but the study wasn't perfect. So, the experiments of this paper were designed to try to get at this question while addressing those concerns. Are actions regretted more than inactions? Using the cognitive psychologist's favorite sample. College students filling out forms. This paper contains 2 experiments, but we're only going to talk about the second one because it covers the same ground as the first one, but more thoroughly. This isn't always the case, but sometimes. When you see a paper like this with overlapping territory between the experiments, sometimes it's happening because they sent that original experiment out for review to be published, got feedback from the reviewers that it was missing some stuff, there's concerns, it needs to be fixed. And why let a perfectly good experiment go to waste? So you tack on those other experiments to address the reviewers' concerns and send it back, hoping that it'll appease them and it gets published. Also remember that this paper contains work from one of the author's doctoral dissertations. So same sort of thing can happen where you go into your proposal with, I have this experiment done, here's what I'm thinking of doing. You get feedback from your committee that, no, actually we think you need to do this highly convoluted experiment. Have fun. In this paper's second experiment, participants were tasked with recalling and writing about 2 regrets they had, one resulting from an action, one from a time they didn't act. They also had to rate the intensity of these regrets. Now, we're going to pop into the conditions figure. Don't worry, we'll walk through it. Participants were randomly assigned into one of 3 conditions. One where they had to recall the inaction regret before the action regret. One with those orders reversed, so action before inaction. And both of those are the fixed choice conditions because the participant doesn't get to pick which they're recalling first. The third condition is free choice, as participants get to essentially pick which they're describing first, action or inaction. Afterwards, they were asked to write about the other type of regret. This allows for all kinds of comparisons. Is there a difference in regret intensity between those who recalled an action regret before an action? Is there a difference between those who got to choose the type to write about first and those without a choice? Are there order effects at all? Does it matter if you write about one type of regret before the other? Which type of regret is regretted more? Participants were given little paper packets to write in that also contained directions that describe the different types of regret for them. In the free choice condition, after writing about the regret, they had to categorize the regret as coming from their inaction, action, or if it didn't fit into those two categories. Then they had to write about the other type of regret from what they already had. In the fixed choice conditions, participants had to write about one type of regret first, and then the other. All participants were tasked with rating the severity of regret on a 1 to 7 Likert scale, with 1 indicating very slight regret to 7 being very strong regret. Participants were also asked to judge whether they're generally more likely not doing something out of fear for what could happen, or doing something out of fear for what would happen if they didn't. Their response to this question categorized them as having greater anticipated regret for actions or inactions. They also had to indicate what they tended to regret more, regretting things they've done or not done. Researchers were brought in to code the free choice participants' descriptions as action or inaction-based regrets. However, this verification or check was not done for the fixed choice participants' responses. Seems like something they should have done, honestly. Looking only at the free choice participants' data, they were significantly more likely to recall inaction regrets, hinting at a bias in which type of regret is more memorable for people. Then the authors compared the rated intensity of regret by condition. Recall that higher ratings indicate more regret. And they did something that annoys me here, even though it's still valid. They have only reported the standard error of the difference between action and inaction regret ratings, as opposed to the standard errors separately. This annoys me because 1, I can't make the happy little plot to depict this data because I don't actually know the errors for each condition, and 2, while the error terms are pretty close for the 3 recall conditions, we can only see it as that way for the differences. It's possible there was some variability in how strongly people were rating the different regrets that got washed out a bit by collapsing the analysis like this. The smaller standard error for the combined data may be a result of standard error itself being dependent on sample size, and the combined sample size is much larger than the individual conditions. For the first of these comparisons, the authors checked out the difference in intensity between action and inaction regrets. They call the regrets, quote, virtually identical in the free choice group, noted a small difference in the forced choice groups, and when all 3 conditions were combined, there was still a small difference. Second, they checked to see that they had adequate power to detect small effects, and they argued that this seems to be the case, so if there was a difference there, they should be able to detect it. Third, there weren't differences in intensity ratings between recall conditions, nor did they find significant order effects. What's visible in the table between the forced choice conditions wasn't statistically significant. Finally, there wasn't a difference in reported intensity between those who had a choice what to recall first and those who didn't. We're going to take a second here just to highlight all of that. People weren't rating the intensity of the action or inaction regrets significantly differently. Keep that in mind. Moving on to the categories people answered themselves into. One dimension was where their greater anticipated regret would be, from acting or not acting. The other dimension was which participants tended to regret more, having acted or not. So one sort of prospective future regret, and one is retrospective past regret. And we're going into another table that takes a little work to parse. Okay, so this has the counts of participants belonging to each bin. The rows of the table are for the anticipated regret, and the columns are for the after the fact regret. This table is a hot mess for a couple reasons. For one, the percentages here are rounded, while in text they are not. It took me an embarrassing amount of time to have that insight. Compounding that for me, this table has a pretty critical formatting error. If you look at the surrounding text, you might notice that the numbers reported on the table don't match what they're saying. So the highlighted claim above says, quote, a significant majority of participants characterize themselves as someone who typically regrets things that are left undone, 59.7%. Cool. But then down in the table, if you look at the left undone column, it's not 59.7%. It's not even 60%. It's 40%. What? Thankfully, the comment that this result replicated a published finding gave us a clue. In that paper, it's the pattern described in the text here, so the table's wrong. If you look at the first column heading, it reads weird. Like, what is anticipated regret done? It looks like the formatting of that column got messed up, so everything should really be shifted over. Like that. Much better. Anyways, comparing between typical past regrets, significantly more people indicated they generally regret not doing things. But if you look at anticipated regret, significantly more people affirmed that fear of the outcomes has prevented them from acting. And this is one of the places the dissertation roots of this article really shows. It's fairly normal to do some wild-ass analyses in your dissertation. Sometimes out of personal curiosity, sometimes because you had a committee member who once saw an analysis at a conference that he thought would be pretty cool to make you do, even though he doesn't know how to do it, your advisor doesn't know how to do it, the people in your department don't know how to do it, the statistics department doesn't know how to do it, nobody at your school knows how to do it, but you're gonna learn. I have experienced both. I read through this statistics discussion following Table 4 and hit a wall. For one, I'm not familiar with McNamar's test, and chi-squares in my statistics tool set, well, let's say it would be in the storage cubby and not the actual toolbox. So I consulted my physicist, as he does chi-squares on the reg. But a physics chi-square is different than a psychology chi-square test, so he wasn't much help other than commenting on how horribly written this paragraph is. Undeterred, I asked someone else's statistician for help. There was again roasting for the writing of this, and a general sense that they were trying to do something new, and so the testing for that can be hard to nail down. However, this statistician wasn't able to help me pass my wall of how these two tests could logically fit together, and because this latter stuff isn't relevant to the discussion at hand, we're just going to skip it. Sorry. So, this paper suggests that when people are tasked with making these regret judgments for their own lives instead of hypothetical people, there isn't a clear view of action regrets being worse than inaction regrets. The takeaway from this paper relevant to Peterson's point is that their results suggest that people, on average, regret the things they didn't do more than the things they did. This is coming from the higher number of inaction regrets recalled first in the free recall condition, and the greater number of people who indicated they typically regret leaving things undone in the past. This is a pattern borne out in subsequent research. But it is interesting that the reported intensity of the regret wasn't different. So you can take solace in the fact that you're going to be cringing equally hard at past you for the things you did and didn't do. An evergreen discussion in psychology is how relevant these results are to day-to-day life. Yes, on average, more people felt regret for the things left undone. Roughly 60% of them. But that still leaves the 40% who indicated greater regret for the things they did. Does this result mean that everyone should go out and do all of the things? Well, dear viewer, that is up for you to decide. But while deciding that, maybe keep in mind that the subject pool for this experiment were intro psych students in college, who, by and large, are very early into adulthood. This experiment, and the ones it built on, and the ones following it, can't speak to the applicability of this pattern of results in older populations. It's possible that this pattern of results will still show up in older adults. Maybe it won't. This experiment can't indicate anything about that. In any case, it is once again story time in Lobsterville, because we can't go terribly far without being hit by another story and its attendant depth analysis. So we're going to skip to the last part. What's up, Is? A character who made the colossal blunder of, quote, remaining passive in the face of life was Peter Pan. And there is a lot of Jung here with all of the archetypes of everything and some interesting interpretations of the story. Like, Captain Hook is apparently Peter Pan's role model, so of course he didn't want to grow up into the archetypal tyrannical king. So we're gonna skip to the last part.
Pan's hypothetical lack of fear of death is not courage, but the manifestation of his basically suicidal nature, the sickness of life, which he is constantly manifesting by his very refusal to mature.
Not gonna lie, there was a very strong temptation to go through Peterson's recounting of the Peter Pan story, the bits and bobs of the Jungian analysis of everything, but just, it wouldn't really accomplish anything. It's not really adding anything substantive to his argument, even though it is entertaining the things he gets wrong, like Wendy, the great love of Pan's life, even though in the story he sort of forgets her. Yes? We will spend a moment here on Peterson's assertion that at Peter's core, he is a suicidal person. As a kid, a lot of the implications went over my head, in part because of my age, but also because being swept away on a magical adventure is pretty common childhood escapism. In rethinking the story for this, especially from Peterson's framing, it seems more to me that Peter's boldness about death could be more reflective of how kids understand death. It takes a while for children to really understand death, particularly if they haven't lost a person in their life. It's much easier to be so cavalier about death if you don't really have a mature understanding of what would happen if Hook won. I mean, hell, even into my early adulthood, even with a better understanding of death and having lost my dad as a teen, I could still feel and act a bit indestructible and at times reckless. None of that means I was possessed by some self-destructive archetype. Like, Peterson goes on at length about Peter stunting his growth so he can remain king of the Lost Boys, and how it's better to remain lost in fantasy with Tinkerbell, who provides everything a female partner could provide, except that she does not exist. What is this adding? But sure, I suppose Wendy deciding not to stay in Neverland with Peter could be interpreted as her sacrificing her childhood in order to grow up. What does any of this have to do with finding meaning where responsibility has been abdicated? Is Peter Pan abdicating responsibility, leaving us to find meaning in that gap? Peterson does have an answer for this, sort of, in his way. All of the Peter Pan stuff is sort of brought back around into you needing to sacrifice the manifold potential of youth to find meaning in life.
Aim at something, discipline yourself, or suffer the consequence. And what is that consequence? All the suffering of life, with none of the meaning. Is there a better description of hell?
Follow my advice or doom. Doom. Something about this is just putting me off. I'm always unhappy when the raisin cookies of certain doom reappear, as it feels like an attempt at coercing people into following his advice out of fear. Although, maybe that's why he's so popular with some of the Christian crowd. It's familiar. Linking this back to something Peterson brought up earlier, quoting Solius again, who is a huge help, sacrifice does not give you spiritual gain in Buddhism. Through meditation, contemplation, and understanding, you can realize your true potential. You can be both the child and the adult. Peterson would beg to differ. If you don't eat your suffering cookies, you can't have any meaning. How can you have any meaning if you don't eat your suffering cookies? Next is a huge pivot to talking about the suffering of the Jewish people as told in the Hebrew scriptures. In addition to Buddhists, my Discord is home to some Jewish peeps who definitely had some opinions about Peterson's interpretation of things. His focus is on the prophets, specifically Abraham, and we get a surprisingly brief recounting of the main points of his story, with some weird details. Like saying he, quote, stayed safely ensconced within his father's tent until he was 75 years old, so was a bit of a Peter Pan himself. Other points: famine, tyranny, maybe getting permacucked, exile, territorial fighting, war, kidnapping in the family, no babies, and plural marriage spousal fighting. The literal nature of Peterson's tent reading was questioned by my chatizens, along with the sense that his emphasis on Jewish suffering, prophet or collective, is missing the point. Quoting my Discord user Jane now, the idea of Torah as a history of suffering in which triumphs are given a grudging nod is a take very indicative of someone having brought their conclusion to the reading rather than gathering conclusions from it. The emphasis on brokenness and suffering, as opposed to a continual effort to bring the world towards a state of justice and loving kindness, misplaces the emphasis, I think. The focus isn't on pain or struggle or trauma as the actual story, but what those things point us to having lost and the ways in which we are commanded to move towards better ways. Peterson's point in talking about this:
The Abrahamic story has at its core a strange combination of pessimism and realistic, genuine encouragement. The pessimism? Even if you are called by God himself to venture out into the world, as Abraham was, life is going to be exceptionally difficult. Even under the best of all conceivable circumstances, almost insuperable obstacles will emerge and obstruct your path. The encouragement? You will have the opportunity to reveal yourself as much stronger and more competent than you might imagine. There is a potential within you. Some of that magic is so evident in childhood that will emerge when circumstances demand and transform you, God willing, into someone who can prevail.
Now, quoting Delasa, where does Peterson get the idea that people don't think being called by God won't involve suffering? This is every prophet's story.
Go be my prophet.
Oh, so the people will love me as your messenger?
Go eat bread cooked over poop.
Sometimes prophets get eaten by fish and then mocked by God because they are sad about a plant. These sorts of insights are why you go straight to the source. Building on these ideas, Jane added that prophets are social critics who are tasked with calling out how society is failing with the goal of moving things back towards progress and justice. And finally, again from Delasa, suffering is connected to doing evil acts, but there is hope of redemption. So again, similar to the problem with Peterson's depiction of suffering in Buddhism, he is seemingly mischaracterizing it in Judaism as well. The trials and tribulations of Jewish prophets aren't necessarily there for their own personal growth. It's a larger reminder of what happens when people lose sight of doing good. Now, Peterson is well within his rights to read whatever meaning he wants into stories. It's just a bit different when he's doing it to stories that are linked to a religious group's beliefs, as opposed to purely fictional works like Harry Potter or Peter Pan. I will say that this encouragement smacks of the groan-inducing God only gives you what you can handle bullshit. Like, be grateful for the suffering that lets you see what you're really made of. Ugh.
More and more, I can consider the possibility that my body is teaching me something useful. That this pain is strengthening my heart and my mind.
Oh, it's fucking strong. Instead of sitting here, graciously accepting the table scraps life has deigned to throw us, why not work to change things so that we can all eat at the table? There will almost certainly always be some form of suffering in life. Death, illness, tragedy. But we can work to mitigate that suffering, make life less shit to go through for so many. And it's now time for the, apparently, compulsory end of section style mad rambling, followed by my point-wise what the fuckery.
There is a very old idea, which I have only recently come to comprehend, at least in part. It is something you see manifested in many literary, imagistic, and dramatic forms, ancient and modern. It has to do with responsibility and meaning, but its true significance appears hidden, in precisely the same way that the wisdom of dreams can bring forth is so often hidden. It is associated with the labyrinthine myth of the hero.
It. Oh my fucking god, get on with it. Enough foreplay for this it.
He who speaks magic words sees what others cannot or refuse to see, overcomes the giant, leads his people, slays the dragon, finds the treasure hard to attain, and rescues the virgin. These are all variants of the same perceptual and behavioral pattern, which is an outline of the universally adaptive pattern of being. The hero is also he who rescues his father from the belly of the beast. What could this idea, expressed so commonly in narrative form, possibly mean?
This really is some monkey's paw shit, isn't it? You complain a couple times that the last book was disjointed, and look what happens. From earlier rules, the magical words and vision, allowing the hero to slay the dragon and snatch that virgin. All indicating some greater truth of being with a capital B that we can Jungishly infer through stories, with the ever so humble Dr. Peterson as our guide. Although you may have noticed that daddy rescue part isn't something previously discussed. Harry Potter certainly wasn't able to save his dad as a baby, and who knows if Peter Pan has a memory of his. No, dear viewer, that new part is basically Peterson's transition into the next section. Consider this my solid attempt at fighting against my instincts here, to give you the full guided tour of the many wild sights in Peterson's retelling of the myths involving the Egyptian gods Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. And whoo boy, there are some sights. He talked about this story in 12 Rules in basically the same framing. Vision, aim, saving the father/civilization, blah blah blah. This time he even supplies us with a footnote reference to when he talked about this in Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules. Naturally. But in the interest of getting through this book before the inevitable sequel comes out, we're just going to hit the high points. There's the importance of functional hierarchies again, and the renewing chaos that can keep them fresh. You should stare down evil when confronted, and you will win. Even if it maims you in the process, you'll be stronger for it. Oh, responsibility is constraining evil and reducing suffering.
Confront the possibility that manifests in front of you every second of your life with the desire to make things better, regardless of the burden you bear, regardless of life's often apparently arbitrary unfairness and cruelty. All other approaches merely deepen the pit, increase its heat, and doom those who inhabit it to continual worsening of their already serious problems. Everyone knows it. Everyone's conscience proclaims it. Everyone's true friend or loved one observes it and despairs when they see someone for whom they care failing to do what needs to be done.
He is so heavy-handed with the doom and its spiral. I almost imagine it as a comically huge mallet he goes after the chaos snakes with. Nothing like keeping on more pressure and perceived danger to readers likely already feeling a bit not great about things. If they don't follow this advice, not only are they dooming themselves, they're dooming their loved ones too. More blah blah about the symbology of the gods and the pharaohs, and then, say it with me now, end of section, style mad rambling.
When you face a challenge, you grapple with the world and inform yourself. This makes you more than you are. It makes you increasingly into who you could be. Who could you be?
I could have sworn this was already answered a couple rules back, in Rule 2 with all the who you could be sections, but guess it wasn't answered then.
You could be all that a man or woman might be. You could be the newest avatar, in your own unique manner, of the great ancestral heroes of the past.
Always anchored in tradition with this guy. Can't have something new. It's gotta be rooted in our ancestors. Although, that dovetails nicely with his general aversion to using the grammatically correct they. Can't even entertain the idea of a them-be avatar in the Western tradition, because then a non-binary identity could become real and part of what we pass down to those following us. Can't have that now, can we? Man or woman? Those are your heroic avatars assigned at birth.
What is the upper limit to that? We do not know. Our religious structures hint at it. What would a human being who is completely turned on, so to speak, be like? How could someone who determined to take the full responsibility for the tragedy and malevolence of the world manifest himself? The ultimate question of man is not who we are, but who we could be.
How fortuitous. He gave us an example of flipping to a specific gender after his attempt at being inclusive. Of course, this determines someone is a man, but not explicitly Jesus. Or at least that's not where he's going next with this, which I am a little surprised at. Also, the saying of there being no higher burden than a great potential popped into my head here. What I'm going to say is a recurring idea for me in this book, and don't get me wrong, I am absolutely supportive of people growing into the best version of themselves, but at a certain point, you have to stop pushing people to do so. They need to want to grow on their own accord, not because an author they're a fan of is threatening them with existential doom if they don't.
When you peer into an abyss, you see a monster. If it is a small abyss, then it is a small monster. But if it is the ultimate abyss, then it is the ultimate monster. That is certainly a dragon, perhaps even the dragon of evil itself. The conceptualization of the monster in the abyss is the eternal predator lurking in the night, ready and able to devour its unsuspecting prey. That is an image that is tens of millions of years old, something coded as deeply in the recesses of our biological structure as anything conceptual can be coded.
Of course we're talking abysses and monsters and ancestral snakes again. Of course we are. But don't worry, he knows how to shake things up.
And it is not just monsters of nature, but the tyrants of culture and the malevolence of individuals. It is all of that, with the latter dominant, terrible as that is to consider. And it is in the nature of mankind not to cower and freeze as helpless prey animals, not to become a turncoat and serve evil itself, but to confront the lions in their lairs.
First, with my pedantic pants comfortably on, lions don't really have lairs. The closest is when a female is giving birth, she might seek out a secluded, sheltered spot to have her cubs, but if Peterson's going in confronting lion cubs, who's the real monster here? Also, yeah, I'm gonna need a citation for that bit about human nature being confrontation and nothing else, because organisms, including humans, respond all kinds of ways to threats. But you know those cultural tyrants, making him go on a self-imposed exile from Twitter for a while for speaking his truth. Much malevolence, so monster. Wow. I suppose he could be implying that people not following behind his rallying flag are not truly human. Wouldn't put it past him at this point.
That is the nature of our ancestors. Immensely courageous hunters, defenders, shepherds, voyagers, inventors, warriors, and founders of cities and states. That is the father you could rescue, the ancestor you could become. And he is to be discovered in the deepest possible place, as that is where you must go if you wish to take full responsibility and become who you could be.
Seriously, it's almost like the section originally went in Rule 2's Who You Could Be subchapter, but they decided to shuffle it here instead. Naturally, there's more conservative-flavored ancestor worship. So wise and so brave. Which, sure, there are certainly aspects of that in everyone's family histories. My maternal great-grandmother rushed her only surviving child out of Germany because she could see which way the wind was blowing and didn't want him used in another war where her family would only suffer. The little bits my mom was told about my grandfather's experiences in World War I as a child were that they would hide from soldiers. Didn't matter what side, what army, they were hiding from them, and for the reasons were not given. Our ancestors weren't perfect. Nobody is. They may have been perfectly civil for their time, but there's loads of skeletons in anybody's family's closet. Of course, this ancestor to become is male, though. I imagine there would be some Jungian hand-waving for not men about needing to dig into the male part of their psyche to find this stuff. But my opinion on the validity of that has been painted all over this channel. Brief summary if you're new? No. This seems like it's setting up that sort of argument about digging around in your unconscious for those archetypes or avatars or whatever, but that's not actually where this next part's going. Nope. The next section feels kind of similar, at least in the gist, to one of the original 12 rules. Specifically, Rule 2. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Beyond Order continues to be the repackaged, resorted, reordered 12 rules for life. Oh well. On that wet fart of an ending. See you next time!